Welcome to Living Well with MS. This podcast comes to you from Overcoming MS, the world's leading multiple sclerosis healthy lifestyle charity, which helps people live a full and healthy life through the Overcoming MS program. We interview a range of experts and people with multiple sclerosis. Please remember, all opinions expressed are their own. Don't forget to subscribe to Living Well with MS on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And now, let's meet our guest.
Welcome to the latest edition of the Living Well with MS podcast. Joining me on this edition is Professor Criag Hassed. Criag is an internationally recognised mindfulness expert. He is co-author of the two top-ranked online mindfulness massive online open courses in the world, was the founding president of Australian Teachers of Meditation Association, and has received the Medal of the Order of Australia for services to medicine. He's also an OMS medical advisor and was actually there for the first person-to-person meeting that I ever had with anyone with OMS, or any sort of formal introduction with OMS, where I met him on a one-day seminar many years ago. So, and he's also been on previous podcast episodes. So welcome back, Craig.
Thank you, Jeff. It's good to be with you.
To get into the questions we have today, so we're going, and I'd encourage people actually to look at previous episodes or listen to previous episodes we've had. But to get us up to date, what does the latest research say on the benefits of meditation for people with chronic conditions such as MS?
Well, I think the important area is really around the jury's not out any longer. It can be tremendously helpful for mental health. Particularly for preventing the relapse of depression, but also helpful for other things like anxiety, etc. So that's one of the big areas, which is mental health. And because our mental health is so intimately related to our physical health as well, it can help in a number of ways there. It's still, you'd have to say there's more research to be done to look at the outcomes for MS, the long-term outcomes in terms of disease progression and so on. So there's still more research to be done there. But what the research seems to show, looking at the broader research on chronic conditions and inflammatory conditions in particular, is that improving our mental health and well-being, reducing our stress, has an anti-inflammatory effect. Or put it the other way, high levels of stress, anger, hostility, poor emotional health has a pro-inflammatory effect. And this is very important for an inflammatory-based condition like MS. But also, if there are any symptoms that we're dealing with, the term sometimes used for that is the bothersomeness of various symptoms seems to be improved through the practice of things like meditation, and helps with things like chronic pain and also with our level of energy and vitality. So there's some of the main areas, although with about 10 new studies being published in peer-reviewed scientific journals every day on just mindfulness itself, with it, not even looking at all forms of meditation. There's quite a lot out there to keep up with.
Yeah, I personally, and I think a lot of people with MS find this. If I eat well and exercise and do those things well, it won't have any effect in the next couple of days. But in the next couple of months, I feel healthier. But with stress, it's almost instant. Certainly the next 5 minutes, I'm going to feel worsening of symptoms. I won't be walking so well. If I'm calm and relaxed, my symptoms are less. It's actually, it's the one thing that is an almost instantaneous effect, and calming myself and deliberately getting into a more mindful state actually reduces symptoms straight away. So, I think you're talking more about the long-term effect, but it actually has an instant effect as well.
Well, yes, it certainly can do. And if we develop the self-awareness associated with being more mindful and aware, then we can recognize more often when we really need it. Like, it's really probably good to look at it as practicing these skills every day, whether we feel like we need it or not. But if we practice it on a regular basis, then when those situations arise when we really do need it, it's much more available for us. So we should see it as a part of our normal day. Some days are easier, some days are tougher. It doesn't mean that those difficult days aren't useful. It's like if you wanted to learn to sail. Some days, if you're out on the water, sailing's easy and comfortable and pleasant. And some days, it's really quite challenging. But if you look at which day is really going to hone your skills in sailing, well, you'd say that the difficult day. And it's a little bit like that with sailing the seas of our own mental and emotional states. If we get the idea that if we practice even on the difficult days, even if it's not apparent to us, that we settle as much, it actually prepares the ground day by day for us to cope better with life's ups and downs, with adversity and so on. And it's important to point out, just because we practice a bit of meditation doesn't mean that all of a sudden everything's going to go the way that we want, but it means that we can certainly cope much better with those challenges that life will inevitably throw at us at various times.
So there's obviously a huge history in meditation and mindfulness. So is there a lot of differences or commonality between meditation practices in, for example, different religions like Buddhism, contemplative prayer in Christianity, Kabbalist, I forget, I'm trying to pronounce kind of Kabbalistic practices in Judaism. So those religious practices through history, do they have any commonality with secular mindfulness-based stress reduction?
Yes, you'd have to say that there are a few basic principles that all meditative practices across various traditions, various cultures have in common. They all involve, in one way or another, training attention, different states of attention, and they all involve the mind. So learning to be less drawn into the thinking, the worrying, the churning mind that's reliving the past, that's worrying about the future, etc. The vehicle that they use for doing that can be quite different. So many mindfulness practices use sensations like the sense of touch, being in touch with the breath, bringing the attention back to that as a resting point. Others, mantra forms of meditation, or internal sort of prayers, if you like, or short phrases that are sounded internally in many spiritual traditions. Again, the attention wanders off, bringing the attention back to that. And then there are various forms of contemplative practice where a person reflects on words, not just on a sound coming back, but actually on the meaning of words, and or affirmations, trying to sort of repeat and ingrain a particular attitude or idea or thought deeply into the psyche, and to reflect on that. But you'd probably say that the main meditative practices, whether it's through mindfulness, stillness meditation, mantra meditation, are really different ways of coming to a sort of a central point of being, or just pure awareness, a sort of a deep state of inner stillness. Coming back to a state of pure awareness or consciousness that goes beyond the thinking mind, the worrying mind, and that sort of sense of being or presence is forever present in the present moment. And so you'd say, like scaling a mountain, different meditative practices take different faces on the mountain, but they all wind up in the same place ultimately on the summit. And so I suppose people of different meditative traditions eventually get to the summit and shake hands and, and sit down, and then we can have a real rest.
That's an optimistic approach to religion, I think. some religions.
Yeah.
So if we wanted to practice a focused meditation, and we wanted to use something like a candle or mala beads or the breath that you mentioned as an object of meditation, what are some tips for doing that?
Well, I think one of the things is that when we start to practice, especially in the early days, we will probably become more aware of how distracted the mind is. It's not until you sort of ask the mind to sit with the breath, or sit with a mantra, or sit, in one way or another, that we actually realize how much running off into its own little world, how much mental commentary is going on in the mind, how much we're living worrying about a future that hasn't happened, how much we spend our life living in a past that's already come and gone. So the first tip really is that mind is distractible, and meditation practices will make that more obvious to us. A point of encouragement, perhaps, if you become aware of how distractible your mind is, that's not a sign you're getting it wrong, that's a sign of progress, because mostly the mind's distractible and we're not even aware that it's distracted. We're often in what's called default mode, mind churning, worrying, ruminating, catastrophizing, talking to itself, etc. They're all examples of what's called default mode. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to really cultivate a change of attitude with which we're noticing these things. Noticing the distracted mind, noticing a wave of anxiety or fear or frustration and so on. So these experiences that we find uncomfortable or irritating are likely to still arise. So we're not just cultivating attention of coming back to the body, to the breath, to the mantra, whatever it might be, but we're also practicing letting go of, not trying to get rid of, but just letting go of the attachment to these things and cultivating an attitude of gentleness with which we notice those things. And the thing is that the awareness tends to arise first. The change of attitude tends to lag behind. So people who are in the early days of their meditation journey, for example, are likely to notice more but get irritated more. And there's this sort of uncomfortable phase until a person learns to notice, but to notice without the criticizing, without the
You
judgment.
feel like you're doing it wrong. Do you
Yeah,
mean like so you just think, oh no, my mind's, and you just get annoyed with yourself because you can't
that's right.
stay focused.
That's right. So the mind wanders off, or we get angry about something, or whatever it might be, and then the mind starts. We notice it, and then the mind starts up with, "What's wrong with me? Why can't I stop doing this? Maybe some people aren't cut out for meditation. Maybe that's me. I wish I was, because it sounds like a good thing to do." And the mind goes on with its a sort of a whole sort of diatribe, which is totally superfluous to requirements. So if we notice the mind wander off, or even if we notice an emotion or a physical sensation that we find uncomfortable, we practice noticing it with a kind of a gentle acceptance, a sort of non-reactivity, a kind of a non-attachment, and not being judgmental about it, a kind of a self-compassion. We're just observing these coming and going states, but we're cultivating that sort of gentler attitude, softening our attitude to those things. And if we can do that, then it starts to change the way that we experience the things we find uncomfortable. So it could be depressive thought comes in, that maybe originally that thought would have come in and we would have gotten angry with ourselves or wished it wasn't there. And of course, when we get reactive to the things we don't like, we fixate our attention on the very thing we're trying to get rid of. We actually become hyper-vigilant for the very thing that we're trying to criticize and get rid of. Whereas when we cultivate that gentler attitude, we notice those things, but they come and go more easily and create less and less and less and less disturbance on the way through. And it takes a little bit of time to cultivate that. We're all a work in progress as far as that's concerned.
So as well as actually having a mindfulness session, whether you're listening to or watching or listening to a mindfulness session or sitting down on your own, a lot of people have mindful time when they're actually doing activity. So it could be they're going for a walk. It could be they're actually doing something more structured like Tai Chi or yoga. If they're doing those activities, what's the best way to quiet the mind? Certainly, I think some of them. I mean, I came to mindfulness probably through yoga, where it's quite formal in there, so you are guided by someone if you're at a yoga class, and therefore it's quite straightforward. But equally, if I'm going for a walk with the dog, it can go one of two ways, and you can actually spend that time worrying about something, thinking about something, pondering about work, or you can actually have a lovely mindful, you're out in the sort of spring sunshine and and actually you're not worrying about those things and you're just taking in nature. And so is there any guidance about how you can make that a more mindful experience, and how you can make it you can quiet the mind during those activities?
Yes, from a mindfulness perspective, the senses are always what I would call a gateway back to the present moment. So walking down, a path, and a thought comes into the mind. Oh, I've got these deadlines at work. And then the mind starts thinking about how many things I've still got to do. And before the end of the year, I've got to do this. And all of a sudden the mind is flooding with thoughts about what if and maybe in the future, etc. And so all of a sudden we're lost in our thinking. We're in default mode, away with the birds, as it were. But meanwhile, if we bring our attention back to the present moment, we might notice there are actually birds singing, or there is dappled sunlight coming through the trees. Or we can just come back to the sensation, the physical sensation of the body walking, the rhythm of the body walking. So the senses will, hearing, seeing, smelling, if it's spring, there'll be things in flower, so if we're sitting down at a meal table, tasting our food, so any sense will bring our attention back to the here and the now, because it connects us back to the body. And the good thing about the body is that it's always in the here and the now. The body's never in the future, it's never in the past. You never get to work in the morning or go somewhere and realize you don't have your body with you. The body's always here and now. The mind is often not. So to help the mind to be here now, we give it the body to pay attention to, and the body communicates with the world through the senses. So all of a sudden you come back, and instead of listening to a whole stream of self-criticism or negative self-talk, etc., all of a sudden we realize, oh, there are the birds, or whether it's traffic sound, or just seeing the plants around us, etc. And this is what's meant by the term coming to our senses, literally coming to our senses. Because when we're lost in our own world of thinking and worrying and ruminating, we're missing the life that we're living, and we're often creating or amplifying problems by the way that we're thinking about them. So the body's in the present moment. If we pay attention through the senses back to where we are, it helps to bring the mind into the present moment. But what we can do, of course, and there's no point in being mindful for 10 minutes sitting in a chair practicing mindfulness meditation and then being unmindful for 23 hours and 50 minutes in the rest of the day. So the aim is to live more mindfully. In the meditation practice, attention goes off, bring it back, attention goes off, bring it back. Get irritated, practice being gentle with ourselves, etc. So if we practice that regularly, then it starts to spill over into our day-to-day life. So we tend to live more time in the present moment. But that sort of ability to train our attention during the meditation practice, when the attention goes off, we notice, we just gently bring our attention back. That's like one rep for the attention circuits in our brain. That's their idea of exercise. And if we don't exercise the attention circuits in our brain, like a muscle that's not being used, it gets pretty weak. Next thing, the mind's running all over the place, and we're giving our attention to any old thing, whether it's useful to give our attention to that or not. So this sort of regular practice of the meditation and being mindful in our day-to-day life starts to open up an ability for us to choose what to give our attention to and what not to give it to. We find that we're more able to give our attention to the thoughts that need it, like we've just remembered something that's relevant or useful, we've just had a creative idea, just had a moment of insight. Well, give our attention to that. But equally, we may recognize there are thoughts that are not worth giving the attention to or not helpful. And we can find it easy to, just like a train of thought, let that train come and go without getting on the train. But if we're not mindful, we get on any old train of thought that comes into our head, and that's not necessarily going to serve us very well.
So a lot of this, we talked about having a regular mindfulness session. And I think most people would find listening to a guided meditation as the most common way of doing this. And there's so many online, and there's courses that you've done, Future Learn courses, and and countless different apps on your phone, and there's loads and loads of resources nowadays, so it is very straightforward. But sometimes you do find yourself um, not with those resources, or you just want to do it on your own. So practicing mindfulness without being guided, um, how is there any tips to doing that, doing an unguided meditation?
In some ways, that's the more useful practice ultimately. Um, you don't necessarily look the guidance, like having a recording that's guiding you, that's reminding you to come back, that is helping you to cultivate a non-judgmental attitude, so that the voice of the person guiding it is a kind of a gentle, non-judgmental, non-reactive kind of attitude they're conveying. That's all very useful. And so when we're practicing with the guidance, it will more often make it feel easier, and we might feel more relaxed. It'll be more pleasant, for example, and we can think, oh, that's the good practice. Whereas when we practice by ourselves for one reason or another, we decide not to use the guided practice, or we just don't have it with us, and we practice, our mind's probably going to wander more, and most people will notice they get more irritated with themselves and think, well, that wasn't as good a practice as the one that was guided. But if you think of the guided practices as like putting trainer wheels on the back of the bike, sort of learning to ride a bike, and those little trainer wheels that stop us from falling off.
Mm-hmm.
Those trainer wheels make it easier and probably more pleasant than if you don't have the trainer wheels off and you on and you're falling off the bike more often. And so you say, which one's better, trainer wheels on or trainer wheels off? You say, oh, trainer wheels on. But if I reframe the question and say, which one's going to train your balance better, trainer wheels on or off? You'd say, oh, well, I suppose trainer wheels off. So from the perspective of cultivating, internalizing our own internal resources, of training attention, of cultivating attitude, it's actually when we're not having the guidance that is ultimately the best. But it's very useful to get comfortable with knowing the practice, feeling like we're understanding it, having guidance for a while, but to sort of, in a sense, wean ourselves off. Maybe revisit the guided practice every so often if you feel you need a top up or reminder or etc. But ultimately, you want to be independent so that you take it anywhere you go. You can be mindful and cultivate that awareness and that attitude anywhere, anytime. So it's a little bit of a sort of a two-edged sword in a way. We don't want to be dependent on the guided practice ultimately.
Yeah, it brings me back actually to the first time I met you, because the time I felt that I'd really had an amazing mindfulness session was actually after the 1 day seminar that I'd had that you were at in Surrey in the UK. Because I was staying with friends and they weren't back from work then, and I'd got back before them, and I thought, well, I'm going to put into practice what Craig was talking about, and I basically just sat down in their hallway and did a mindfulness practice just purely on my own, and that, I think, because I'd had the guidance that you gave us, so I'd got that sort of almost education of everything, and but then doing it completely on my own, I actually found, and I always sort of remember back to that and think, right, that sort of was the best session that I had. And I think you're right. The guided stuff is good because it gives us the foundations of everything. But then actually, if we can do it on our own, it can work very effectively. So you mentioned earlier a bit about mantras, and this is something I've come across in a few guided meditations, a few different things. But one of the mantras are affirmations. So how can that be effective in meditation?
Well, again, firstly, the mantra can help to take us beyond the busyness of the mind, rather than chasing every thought, every worry down its rabbit hole and so on, bringing the attention back to the mantra. And the mantra, I suppose you could see it like a vehicle that takes a person from the busyness of the ordinary thinking mind to eventually even a stillness where the mind puts down the mantra as well, just that sort of simple state of being. Affirmations are slightly different. There's an intentional sounding or repetition of a thought or a phrase. And in a way, this is like maybe using a kind of ingraining a particular thought to remove another thought. So you might choose a particular affirmation to deal with a particular issue that the mind is dealing with, like some sort of self-criticism or some kind of lack of confidence. So a person might choose a particular affirmation that gives them hope or helps to give them confidence. So a person's sounding that, and it's like with the attention given to that, the person's trying to ingrain that particular thought by removing another thought. It's like using perhaps a thorn, which is sharp, but you're using that thorn to remove another thorn. So that's stuck in the foot, as it were. It's so those affirmations can be very useful. It, in a sense, doesn't take us beyond the whole thinking mind, because ultimately forms of meditation that take us kind of to that deeper state of being, the thinking this, that, or the other thing, it kind of almost becomes irrelevant. I suppose you'd say affirmations still working on the level of the mind, they can be useful, but they won't take us beyond the thinking mind necessarily. That's what perhaps other meditation practices can do.
So a mantra would just be a almost like an om or a sound or something. It doesn't actually have to have meaning attached to it.
No, not necessarily. But the affirmations, of course, they can be just purely kind of secular, whether it's just a statement of having confidence in yourself or your own abilities, etc. But of course, I suppose in a kind of a manner of speaking, various forms of prayer were kinds of affirmations to foster compassion or to foster patience or to cultivate, some particular quality. So, they can certainly have a religious or spiritual kind of focus as well. So there's a kind of a little bit of an overlap with some forms of affirmations, and of course, prayer would be a kind of perhaps a form of that as well, but within a particular religious or spiritual context. But the mantra doesn't necessarily have to have a particular meaning. It might be a word that has meaning, but it could be in a different language. So if you're practicing, the ancient Benedictine forms of mantra meditation, from the time of St. Benedict, they were using Aramaic mantras. So if you use an Aramaic mantra, well, I suppose there's a translation of that word, but you're not necessarily trying to actively think about what this word means. You're just following the sound to stillness. If you're using maybe Eastern forms, for example, then you'd be using maybe a Sanskrit sound, etc. When Herbert Benson was doing his first research with mantra meditation back in the late 70s, early 80s, they were just using a simple word, which could be one or peace or some other word, and following that word to stillness. But so there are a few varieties, if you like, a few variations on the theme.
But it's the repetitiveness of the same phrase or sound that's the key to that mantra part of it. Is that correct?
That's right. So that the quiet, rhythmical repetition of that, and following that, the mind thinks of other things, just leaving those other things alone, coming back to that sound. And that sound, the rhythm of the sound may well change, may well deepen or lengthen over time, may get quieter and quieter, may become eventually just almost like a pulse of a sound, may eventually just come to a deep place of stillness. So it's almost like it lets you out at that other end of the journey.
We hear quite a lot recently about cognitive behavioural therapy or CBT techniques, particularly with people with mental health conditions and stress, anxiety, and so on. And that is with people with MS as well, as affecting people with MS. So, what are some of the CBT techniques that we could use on our own to change us out of an unhealthy thought process.
Yeah, CBT, well, cognitive focuses on how we think,
Mm-hmm.
and behavioral can focus particular behaviors. So, from the thinking perspective, um, it's really looking at the contents of thoughts. And quite often in a collaborative process with the psychologist, for example, looking at a particular kind of thought that might be causing us problems in one way or another, negative mood or anxiety about things, but looking at that thought, questioning that thought, looking at the evidence for that thought. So we might have a thought like I'm terrible, or I'm always a failure, or something else, and that thought may have very little to do with reality. We might have not been successful at this and this in our lives, but that doesn't mean I am a failure. This sort of all or nothing kind of thinking. And so the person who's guiding a person through CBT would help the person to question that thought, to look at the validity of it. In the process, there's a kind of a standing back from the contents of the thought itself. And what we'll tend to find is that those kinds of thoughts don't actually stand up to scrutiny. They're a distortion, they're an exaggeration of the reality, and they don't have any nuance to say, well, yes, okay, well, I wasn't successful at this and this, but of course there was success at that and that and the other thing. And is this even failure anyway, or is it just I'm learning? I'm just learning from experience. So there's an ability to kind of reframe the thinking, if you like. And so CBT sort of looks at the contents of the thoughts, and bit by bit, as a person gets more objective and looks at them, may find that those thoughts have less and less effect on how the person thinks. The person gets less taken in by those thoughts, as it were. With the mindfulness forms or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, it's not so much looking at the contents of thoughts, but the relationship to the thinking process itself. So just sitting in stillness, just watching, and thoughts come and go, and another thought comes and goes, and it might be a thought like, I'm a failure or something else, but you're actually realizing that that thought comes and goes, and you get a sense, wait a sec, I'm sitting here watching this thought come and go, and that thought come and go, and the next thought come and go, and then a thought about I'll have a cup of tea after I sit down and practice this, and then a thought about, will I go somewhere, on Friday night, whatever it might be. All of a sudden you realize these thoughts are coming and going, but you're the watcher, you're the observer of those thoughts, and those thoughts are not you. And it's a bit of a penny drop moment when we realize that, oh, wait a sec, you kind of realize you're standing back from the thoughts, and so all of a sudden the contents of the thought become less relevant. You just realize that through non-attachment to the thoughts that you're just the observer of them, and you can engage with or leave those thoughts alone as you choose. And that's quite a liberating kind of thing. But mindfulness takes a slightly different route to conventional CBT. It teaches us to have a different relationship to the whole thinking process itself.
And another type of meditation that I think people will definitely come across if they listen to lots of guided meditations is loving kindness meditation. So, I mean, a lot of these things I quite like them just as meditation, but is there any evidence that practicing these sort of meditations has long-term benefits for the practitioner?
Well, yes, for the person practicing them, they can certainly have significant benefits, particularly in certain contexts, anger, frustration, criticism, and so on, difficult relationships with others. So those kinds of practices can be particularly useful there. Practices that help us to cultivate loving kindness or compassion. It's interesting, cultivating compassion to oneself and compassion to others. It sounds like, well, it should be easy, just practice a bit of compassion, but it's actually really not that easy, because as soon as many people notice if they try to practice loving kindness or a compassion practice, maybe to themselves, they'll notice an intense resistance to doing that. Notice a kind of a criticism, a kind of judgmentality that's turned on ourselves. And so it really holds a mirror up to that. But if we just patient work with that, we can cultivate compassion with ourselves, but then hopefully more compassion, with the people that we live and walk with in our day-to-day life. And there might be maybe a few people in the world for whom we have some quite significant issues, one way or another. And we don't necessarily start with those most difficult relationships, but if we can cultivate loving kindness or compassion for those people in due course, if we find, start with what's a bit easier first, but if we can cultivate compassion there, we may find that it has enormously beneficial effect on reducing anger, resentments, a tendency to live in the past. Sometimes people say that, like for those difficult relationships that we might have had in our lives, but do I have to forgive and so on? Well, we don't have to forgive. But we can certainly bring awareness to the cost of resentment and hatred and anger and so on, the effect that it has on ourselves. But from a biological point of view, it's like fuel on the inflammatory fire. And the thing is that compassion is associated with activation of areas of the brain that are associated with very positive emotions. And it has an anti-stress, an anti-inflammatory effect, right? So cultivation of compassion, loving kindness is like it helps to dampen that fire, which is often and you see that inflammatory response is a big part of the stress response. And when we're activating that day after day, it's not going to do ourselves any good, mentally, emotionally, physically. So there's increasing evidence that cultivation of things like compassion and loving kindness are very good for us. But these are not the first practices to start with necessarily, because they sound like they should be easy and all lovely and so on, but they're often actually quite difficult. And we need it. It really helps if we've got some nice, good guidance through that.
And to go a step further, there are meditation practices that actually talk about physical healing. So they're actually visualizing healing yourself physically. And I quite enjoy these and actually sort of think about my brain getting better in sort of like lesions lessening and almost like my brain fixing it and that information passing smoothly down nerves and that idea of thinking of your body fixing itself. But is that taking it a step too far, or is there any evidence that you could use that sort of power of the mind to actually fix physical symptoms?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Jeff. There's much less research to say that visualizing, something happening in the brain will actually produce that effect. It might produce a kind of a sense of comfort or ease or confidence in some kind of way. But there's much less research to say, well, what effect does it have on the brain other than that? Does it actually heal lesions, etc.? So, but I'll nuance that and say, well, what seems to happen, if I could put it this way, the anger, frustration, rumination, worry, etc., put a stress on the system. We're imagining wrestling a tiger, as it were, having an argument with the boss or whatever it might be, and we're creating stressors out of thin air, and we're activating that fight or flight response. It's accentuating inflammation. It's putting stress on the cardiovascular system, etc. Not good for the body, not good for the brain. And so what these meditative practices do, mindfulness does, is it kind of helps to reduce that. So when we reduce that unnecessary inflammation, it's like taking the static and the distortion out of the system. Then all of a sudden the harmony is in the background. It's like if you're listening to Mozart's music, but there's a lot of static and distortion over the top of it. You get some of the music, but you get a lot of other stuff as well. So if you remove the static and the distortion, the stress, then you've just left with the harmony. And what that means is the body's always trying to re-heal, balance itself, repair itself. And so that really allows the body to do what it's trying to do already, but to do it better. Now, in relation to things like visualization practices, so there's that kind of visualizing the body healing something. Well, I think that process will happen by itself if we just reduce it. But there are other kinds of visualization practices where there's a bit more research. Some of this has come from things like stroke research, etc. But when we mentally visualize ourselves doing something, so say in some of the research on stroke, a person may have lost the use of an arm or a leg, and they're going through rehabilitation, but they're doing mental practice. So in a guided way, they're being taken through physical activities where they're lifting their arm, they're imagining themselves lifting their arm, they're imagining themselves picking things up, etc. So they're really in a very concentrated way imagining the body doing that. Then what happens when we imagine that physical action? It stimulates the circuits in the brain that are associated with doing that action. And when we stimulate the circuits in the brain in that way, and if there's a blockage for getting the message through, it keeps kind of knocking on the door and stimulates either new growth and to try and bridge that gap, or to find another way of getting the message through. And what they've found in that research is that people rehabilitate faster and better, get more function back, if they have the mental practice as well as the physical physiotherapy rehabilitation, for example. And other people use this as well, like athletes or, concert pianists. They're on a long haul flight and they haven't got a grand piano on the plane to practice on, but they mentally rehearse the piece. And when you're mentally rehearsing that, you're activating all the areas of the brain associated with playing that piece. It's nearly as good as actually doing the rehearsal. So that's one way in which I'd say that kind of mental visualization may have a clearer and more established place. But the jury's a little bit out on. What I would say is that the body's ability to repair itself is facilitated when we just settle down our tendency to get drawn into all of this thinking and agitating and worrying and ruminating, etc., that the mind is so often doing on an unconscious level.
There was one, someone actually asked me to do a guided meditation. There was a technique where it was improving walking ability in people with MS. And so basically just talking through the process of walking and exactly your heel going down, transferring weight, and just that whole process. And it's the actual, I put it on Insight Timer and I might redo it at some point. It's the only thing I've ever put in anything like that. I think I got the tempo slightly wrong. Actually, it's sort of slightly too quick, but I might do it again because I actually listen to it myself, even though it's me talking. I'm bizarrely listening to my own guided meditation sometimes, but I do think it works. And like you were saying, that sort of process. So you're basically working, you're effectively exercising the mental part of the act of walking, which when we've got a cognitive, it's so people with MS have got a condition that's a neurological condition that actually it's not so much our muscles that the issue, it's the mind and you're controlling the muscles. So actually if we can exercise that bit, then that probably is as beneficial as the exercising the physical bit.
Yes, I was having a conversation recently with a well-known Australian former Olympic athlete, and she said one of the things she trained herself in the lead up to the Olympics was this sort of mental practice of mentally rehearsing the race, but mentally imagining the body just running rhythmically and without tension and so on. So it's just, and that kind of mental rehearsal, because you're actually giving those circuits in the brain a wake-up call, and it'll help to sort of re-establish connections or find other ways to get those messages through. So there may be, I think there probably is, some untapped potential. And from a meditative point of view, again, it's the use of attention, but in a particular kind of way in this case. But see, attention is, or consciousness, if you like, is like an energy source. It'll power whatever it's given to, for better or for worse. We feed a lot of attention to a whole lot of angry thoughts or critical thoughts. We empower them, and they start to have an effect. But equally, we can start to use that attention in far more productive, far more conscious ways. And these are perhaps a few of them that we could use.
Before we finish up, I'd like to say just encourage people to have a look at your courses on Future Learn, actually, because it's I think it's is it 4 weeks? Quite the first one. So it's quite a long thing, but it actually goes through these different practices, and you do learn a lot about it. And you do also, I mean, mindfully eating is in there, and all sorts of things. So it is covering a huge range of things. And I just think having that grounding of an understanding is really, really beneficial. And I think, and it's free. I'm not selling something here. They're free courses,
Yeah.
so you can sign up for them, and I found them really, really useful to go through. But to actually finish up, would it be possible that we could end with a guided meditation for us to follow?
How long would you like it to go for, Jeff?
Well, 5 minutes. Would that be okay?
Sure. Okay. Well, let's just have a sort of very simple practice, and especially if people are listening to this and are new to meditation, I would encourage them not to put any pressure on themselves to try and get it right, or just to keep the process simple. Just finding a balanced position for the body if you're sitting up, or if you're lying down, just a symmetrical position for the body. Of course, lying down, more likely to go to sleep, so sometimes it's actually more useful to sit up if we can. And with the eyes gently closed, this is going to be not an exercise in tuning out or going off somewhere else. We're actually going to practice tuning in and being here now. So the first thing is just to simply be aware of the body and its posture on the chair. And so we're using, in a very broad sense, the sense of touch. There might be an awareness of the points of contact between the body and the chair. We're just noticing points of contact between the clothes and the skin. And whatever the sensations might be, just noticing them. There's no particular sense that they should be one way or another. Just noticing the sensations without any particular attitude to them. Just here, just now. And in the process of paying attention to the body, we might also notice the thoughts come and go, or the mind wanders off. The mind starts talking to itself about one thing or another, and if that happens, just noticing very gently, practicing letting those thoughts come and go without having to do anything about them. Not even thinking that they shouldn't be there, just practicing very gently, leaving them alone, and just in touch with the body once again, just sitting on the chair. There's one particular sensation that's always taking place, and it just happens to be that of the breathing. And so if you're happy to, just drawing in a deep breath and letting it out slowly and gently. And another breath in and letting it out slowly and gently. And from that point, just letting the body breathe as it wants to. without any need to control the breathing or to interfere with it, but just simply feeling the sensation of the air as it enters and as it leaves, whether that's through the nose or the mouth, just feeling the in-breath, feeling the out-breath. And again, thoughts may come and go, or the mind may wander, and if that happens, just noticing. Once again, just cultivating a gentleness with which we let those thoughts come and go. Not having to do anything about them. Just very gently preferring the breath. Good. Good. So now just simply being aware of the body and its posture once again. And allowing the eyes to gently open whenever you're ready. Good. Good. I wasn't timing it, but it's probably about 5 minutes, I think, Jeff.
I think it was. It always seems like time flies actually when you're meditating. It seems like I always think like 2 minutes, and then you think actually it's. I think that's probably a good thing, is it? I think because you probably if you're concentrating on lots of things happening, maybe time does travel at different speeds, doesn't it?
Yes, that's right. I think that's one of the things about why time seems to stretch out so much more for children. I think that young children are so much more in the present moment that day feels like a long time, a year feels like a lifetime. So, in sort of a way, I think we should be a little bit like children again, that simplicity of being in the moment.
And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us again, Professor Criag Hassed. And again, encourage everyone to have a look at the show notes. Loads of resources which are very, very useful. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Living Well with MS. Please check out this episode's show notes at overcomingms.org/podcast. You'll find useful links and bonus information there. Have questions or ideas to share? Email us at podcast@overcomingms.org, or you can reach out to Jeff on Twitter @JeffAlex. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for tuning in, and see you next time for tips on living a full and happy life with MS.